There's a moment in every powerful man's life when the crown he wears stops feeling like glory and starts feeling like a cage. King Charles III had worn many cages in his 75 years. The cage of duty, the cage of expectation, the cage of a marriage the world watched crumble in real time. He had survived all of them. He had buried his mother. He had buried his first marriage. He had buried, or so he believed, the last of the storms that followed his name. He had Camilla now. He had the throne. He had peace. He was wrong about the peace. The morning of March 4th, 2024 began the way mornings at Buckingham Palace always begin, with a silence so formal it has its own dress code. The corridors were lit before the sun touched them. The staff moved in practice choreography, silver trays balanced on white-gloved hands, footsteps so measured they barely registered on marble floors that had heard the footsteps of empire. Charles had slept poorly. He had been sleeping poorly for weeks, though he would not say so to anyone, not to his aides, not to his doctors, not even to Camilla, who noticed anyway, the way she always noticed, and said nothing the way she had learned to say nothing. She had learned a great many things in the years since they finally, legitimately, became what they had always secretly been to each other. But the morning of March 4th was not ordinary. Something had shifted in the air inside the palace, the way air shifts before a storm that hasn't announced itself yet. Charles felt it before he understood it. He had been king long enough to know that certain silences aren't peaceful. They're waiting. The briefing arrived at 7:42 in the morning. Not through the usual channels. Not through his private secretary's calm, bureaucratically neutral summary of the day's concerns. It arrived through a source much older, much less official, and because of that, far more alarming. One of the senior members of the household division, a man who had served the crown for 23 years, whose loyalty was so embedded in his bones it had practically replaced calcium, had, late the previous evening, submitted a formal internal complaint. Not a whisper, not a quiet word in a corridor. A formal, documented, signed complaint routed through proper channels, which meant it could not be made to disappear, which meant it already existed in writing somewhere, which meant it was already, in the cold language of institutional reality, real. The complaint named the Shand family, Camilla's family. Charles read it standing up, which was unusual for him. He normally sat for briefings. He had been trained since boyhood to absorb bad news from a seated position, to let the posture absorb the shock before it reached his face. But this particular document arrived through channels that bypassed the usual cushioning, and he was still standing by the window with the morning light coming in flat and gray off the London skyline when the words arranged themselves into something he could not immediately organize into a response. The complaint alleged, formally, documented, signed, that members of the Shand family had, over the course of the past 18 months, used their proximity to the Queen Consort to pursue interests that constituted, in the complainant's language, a material conflict with the dignity and security interests of the crown. It was precise language. It was the kind of language a man uses when he has been thinking carefully about what he is about to say and wants to make sure it cannot be dismissed as gossip. The complainant wasn't gossiping. He was making a record. He was asking, formally, that the palace review and limit. The word he used was limit, not sever, not yet, the access of Camilla's immediate family members to certain royal functions, estates, and informal networks of influence that had, by his accounting, grown considerably in scope since the coronation. Charles set the document down on the windowsill. He picked it up again. He set it down. There's a particular kind of emotional experience that powerful men are almost never prepared for, despite their power, despite every resource available to them, despite the armies of advisors and the centuries of protocol designed to manage exactly this kind of situation. It is the experience of watching the private and the institutional collide in a space where you cannot separate them. Charles had lived through that collision once before, publicly, catastrophically, in a marriage that dissolved in front of a television audience of millions. He had promised himself, in the private language men use when they make promises only to themselves, that he would never inhabit that collision again. He was inside it again. He walked from the window to his desk. He sat. He stood again. The palace was beginning its morning rhythm around him, doors opening, Voices at a professional distance. The whole machinery of monarchy turning over like an engine that has no mechanism for stopping. His private secretary, Edward Hartley, 51, discreet, the kind of man whose discretion had itself become a form of presence, appeared in the doorway at 8:15 with the day's formal schedule and a look on his face that told Charles he had already been briefed. "You've seen it," Charles said. "Yes, sir." "Who else?" "At this stage? For people. Myself, the comptroller, the head of household security, and the deputy private secretary." Hartley paused, the pause doing more work than whatever sentence was going to follow it. "It is, sir, a formal document. Its existence in the system means I know what it means." Hartley said nothing. He had learned, in 9 years serving Charles, that sometimes the most useful thing he could offer was the architecture of silence. Charles sat down at his desk. He pressed his fingers together at the tips, a gesture so habitual it had become a kind of private semaphore for the mood underneath it. Outside the window, a guard was performing his slow, precise walk along the palace forecourt, back straight, eyes forward, the entire weight of institutional loyalty visible in the mechanics of his movement. Charles watched him for a moment. That man out there in the bearskin and the scarlet was doing exactly what the complaint writer inside the building was doing. Both of them were in their different ways expressing the same thing: loyalty to the crown. The question, the uncomfortable and dissonant question that Charles could feel arranging itself in the morning air of his study, was whether those two expressions of loyalty were pointing in the same direction. Camilla was at that hour in her own rooms, 2 corridors away, beginning her morning with the ritual efficiency of a woman who had spent decades preparing for days that required her to be unflappable in public. She had her tea. She had her newspapers. She had, in the small, deliberate way she managed the emotional weather of her mornings, a kind of composure that Charles had always privately envied and loved in equal measure. She did not yet know about the document. Charles had 7 hours, perhaps, before she would. He was not sure he wanted more time than that. The Shan family, Camilla's brother Mark, her sister Annabelle, and the wider network of cousins and connections that orbit any aristocratic family with newly elevated proximity to power, had in the years since the coronation become a subject of low-level institutional friction that Charles had been, if he was honest with himself, choosing not to look at directly. It wasn't that he believed anything improper was happening. It wasn't that he distrusted Camilla. He trusted Camilla more completely than he had trusted any person in his adult life. More than advisors, more than courtiers, more than the well-meaning apparatus of guidance that surrounds a king and occasionally mistakes itself for the king's conscience. He trusted her. The problem was not trust. The problem was the gap between what trust knows and what institutions can accommodate. Marchand had died years before any of this, 2014, a fall in New York, sudden and senseless, and Charles had grieved that loss alongside Camilla, had held her in the private space of shared grief that is one of the quiet architectures of a real marriage. But the Shan family extended beyond Mark, and some of those extensions had, in the warmth of the post-coronation period, expanded their presence in ways that were beginning to register on the internal sensors of the institution. A royal household is, among other things, a finely calibrated instrument for detecting the gravitational effects of proximity to power. Someone had detected something. Someone had put it in writing. By 9:30, Charles had read the complaint 4 times. By 10 o'clock, he had asked Hartley to arrange a private meeting with the head of household security for the following morning. Deliberately not today, because today he needed to think before he talked, and because any meeting arranged too urgently would itself become information that moved through the palace at the speed such information always moves. By 11 o'clock, he had a morning of engagements. A briefing from the Foreign Secretary's office on a trade matter with South Africa, a virtual address to a conservation foundation, a private lunch with the Archbishop of Canterbury that had been arranged 6 weeks earlier and was, in the loaded language of royal scheduling, not optional. He performed all of it. He performed it the way he had been performing duty since he was 4 years old, and first understood that the word meant something different for him than it did for other people. He was attentive in the briefing. He was warm in the address. He was thoughtful and present over lunch with the Archbishop, who was a man of genuine personal substance, and deserved that attention. Charles gave it. He had been giving it his whole life, the full weight of himself to whatever the moment required, while whatever was happening underneath stayed underneath. But in the 15 minutes between the South Africa briefing and the virtual address, standing in a small anteroom office study with a cup of cooling tea, the thing he had been holding back all morning reached his face before he could prevent it. Not fully, not in any way that someone watching him would have been able to name. Just a single movement. His jaw tightened, his eyes closed for 3 seconds longer than a blink, and when they opened, the look in them was not the king's look. It was the look of a man who is very tired, and has been very tired for a very long time, and who has just been handed one more thing to carry. Hartley, who happened to be present, looked away. This, too, was a skill he had cultivated over 9 years. The ability to look away at the precise moment when looking would cost a man something. The document was real. The meeting would happen. The family question would have to be addressed. Charles knew all of this with the cold clarity of a man who has spent his entire adult life navigating the space between what he feels and what must be done. He would address it. He would find a way to address it that did not break what he had spent 20 years building. He would protect Camilla. He would protect the crown. He would find the path between those two things. He just had to find it before the document found a way out of the 4 rooms it currently lived in. Because if it got out, and Charles was a realist about institutions, about human beings, about the metabolism of secrets inside large organizations where everyone has a different understanding of what loyalty means. If it got out, nothing about the next several months would be manageable or controlled or private. The guard was still walking his precise line outside. Back straight, eyes forward, loyal to an institution that was, at this moment, in the process of asking its king a question no amount of protocol had ever prepared him to answer. How do you choose between the woman who is your peace and the institution that is your purpose? Charles didn't know yet, but in 48 hours he was going to have to. Camilla found out on a Tuesday. Not from Charles, not from Hartley, not from any of the carefully arranged channels that were supposed to govern the flow of sensitive information inside the palace. She found out the way women who have spent decades inside complicated institutions always eventually find out, from the quality of the silence around her, from the way 3 separate members of the household staff were professional in precisely the same way, in the same hour, on the same morning, from the way her own lady-in-waiting, Sophie Brentwood, answered a question about the afternoon schedule with an answer that was technically correct and emotionally absent, which in 20 years of reading people Camilla had learned to translate instantly. Something is happening that you have not been told about yet. She was in the blue drawing room at 10:30, where she spent 2 mornings a week attending to her correspondence and the quiet infrastructure of her patronages, charities, and causes that had accumulated around her years of public life the way barnacles accumulate on a ship, not beautiful individually, but together forming something substantial and real. She had read 6 letters and responded to 3 of them when she set down her pen and looked at the room with the particular quality of attention she reserved for moments when her instincts were telling her something her information hadn't caught up to yet. She called Charles at 11:04. Not his private secretary. Him, on the line they used between themselves, the one that rang in his study on a small phone that sat to the left of his reading lamp and had no official designation. He answered on the second ring. "When were you going to tell me?" she said. There was a pause. Not the pause of a man caught off guard, but the pause of a man who has been waiting for a moment, and now that the moment has arrived is taking a single breath before entering it. "This evening," he said. "I wanted to understand it better before. Tell me now." He told her. All of it. The document, the complaint, the name of the family member who had submitted it, the 4 rooms it currently occupied, the meeting scheduled with the head of household security the following morning. He told her in a measured, exact way he communicated things that mattered. No softening at the edges, no strategic omissions, the full shape of it. Camilla had told him once, early in their public life together, that she needed him to tell her hard things the way they actually were, not the way they had been predigested by advisors to minimize her reaction. He had taken that request seriously. He was honoring it now. She listened without interrupting. This was one of the things about Camilla that the public never fully saw: the capacity for stillness when stillness was what a situation required. She could be devastating with wit when a situation required wit. She could be warmth itself in a crowd of people who needed warmth. But in the private register of hard information, she went quiet in a way that was not passive. It was the quiet of someone processing something fully before deciding what to do with it. When he finished, she was silent for 4 seconds. He counted. He had learned to let her count. "Is it true?" she said. "Not what you'd expect. Not is it fair, or how dare they, or I can't believe this. Is it true?" "I don't know," Charles said. "That's what I'm trying to establish." "Then establish it," she said. "And, Charles, if it is even partially, I need to know that before anyone else does." She ended the call. She picked up the letter she had set down. She put it back down again. She looked at the window. Outside, through the drawing room glass, the formal garden spread itself in the precise geometry of a place that had been designed never to look accidental. Everything in its place. Everything at a measured distance from everything else. Camilla had, over the years, made a kind of private peace with living inside architecture that was designed to communicate permanence and order. She was not naturally an ordered person. She was warm and chaotic and funny in ways that made the formality of her position feel, to people who spent real time with her, slightly absurd. But she had learned the architecture. She had learned to inhabit it. She had not, however, learned to watch her family become a problem inside it without feeling it in a way that was personal before it was political. Because the truth, the part Charles didn't have yet, the part she was already sitting with in the blue drawing room while he was still in his study assembling the institutional picture, was that she had sensed something shifting in her brother's family's behavior over the past 6 months. Had noticed, in the careful way she noticed things she didn't want to name yet, a loosening around the edges of how certain family members talked about the palace, about access, about what the word family meant now that she was queen consort. She had not named it because naming it would have required her to act on it, and acting on it would have required conversations she was not ready to have with people she loved. And the thing about loving people who are sometimes problematic is that you hold the knowledge of their problem in a way that is physically uncomfortable, the way you hold an ice cube longer than is reasonable, waiting for it to become something other than cold. The ice was now sitting on the palace's official desk. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, Camilla had made 3 phone calls. One to her sister Annabelle, which was short and whose content she would not repeat to anyone. One to her private solicitor, which was professional and clipped, and which the solicitor would later describe as the clearest brief I've received from her in 15 years. And one to a woman who had been her close friend since before Charles, since before any of this, who answered and said nothing for a moment when Camilla explained the situation, and then said, "God, Camilla," which was the most honest response anyone offered her that day. Meanwhile, inside the institutional machinery that had now been set in motion, the 4 rooms the complaint occupied were in the slow, irresistible process of becoming 5 rooms. And then 6. The head of household security, a former Army colonel named Desmond Fairweather, who had the manner of a man who has heard everything and found most of it less surprising than people expected, had in the 24 hours since the complaint's arrival conducted what he would formally describe as a preliminary review of relevant correspondence and access logs. What this review revealed was not, in itself, damning. No laws broken, no clear protocol violations. But there was a pattern, the kind of pattern that institutional professionals are trained to see precisely because it doesn't announce itself, because it accumulates in the spaces between things that are formally permitted. Access requests filed under Camilla's household that, when viewed individually, were each explainable and defensible, but viewed together over an 18-month period suggested a systematic and expanding use of royal proximity for purposes that were, in Fairweather's dry professional language, not clearly aligned with the interests of the institution. He brought this summary to Charles on Wednesday morning. The meeting lasted 47 minutes. Charles asked 14 questions, which Fairweather answered with the careful precision of a man who knew that every word he offered to a king in a moment like this would be turned over and examined from multiple angles before it was put to use. What Fairweather communicated, without saying it in a way that could be quoted back to him, was that the complaint was not baseless, that the pattern was real, and that the longer the palace delayed a formal response, the more likely it became that the document would find its way out of the 6 rooms it now occupied. Charles sat with that information for a long time after Fairweather left. The meeting had been in the small private study off the main corridor, a room with no particular historical significance, which was why Charles used it for conversations he wanted to happen in a space that didn't echo with precedent. He sat in a chair that had been chosen for comfort rather than ceremony, which was unusual in this building, and stared at a bookshelf that contained, among other things, 3 volumes on constitutional history and a battered paperback copy of a Patrick O'Brian novel that Camilla had left there 2 years ago, and neither of them had moved. He thought about his mother. This was something he did in hard moments, not from sentiment exactly, but from a kind of practical consultation, a habit of asking what she would have done, how she would have held the competing weights of personal love and institutional demand. Elizabeth II had been, among her many other qualities, a supreme practitioner of the discipline of compartmentalization. She had kept her private self and her royal self in separate rooms with separate keys, and she had never, in 70 years of reign, accidentally left one door open while she was in the other room. Charles had always admired this. He had also, if he was honest, found it slightly terrifying, because what it required, the total separation of wife from institution, of mother from monarch, of personal love from public duty, was exactly what this moment was asking of him. And he was not, had never been, the compartmentalizer his mother was. The question of what to do about the Shand family complaint was in some ways simple. The institutional path was clear. Acknowledge the complaint, conduct a formal review, implement whatever access restrictions the review recommended, document the process. Clean, defensible, institutional. The palace had been navigating exactly this category of problem for 300 years, and it had protocols for all of it, protocols that had been designed precisely to remove the personal from the equation so that the decision-maker could act from duty rather than feeling. The problem was that Camilla was not a protocol. She was his wife. She was the woman he had loved for 40 years in ways that had cost both of them significantly, in ways that had survived a marriage, a divorce, a death, a public crucifixion of their private story, and, finally, improbably a coronation. She was 76 years old, and she laughed from her actual body, and she left Patrick O'Brian paperbacks in his study, and she had, 2 nights before any of this happened, reached across the dinner table to correct something he'd said about hydrangeas with such cheerful authority that he'd spent the rest of the evening smiling without quite knowing why. And her family, some of them, perhaps, not understanding what they were doing, perhaps not intending the pattern that Fairweather had mapped, was, in the cold ledger of institutional reality, becoming a problem that required an institutional solution. He called her at 4:15. "We need to talk tonight," he said. "Properly. At dinner." "I know," she said. Dinner that evening was private. Just the 2 of them, in the small dining room on the 2nd floor that they used when there were no guests, and they wanted the particular privacy of a table set for 2 in a room where no staff were present after the food was served. They had used this room through a number of difficult evenings over the years. It was a room that had, without any formal designation, become the room where they were honest with each other. Charles told her what Fairweather had found. All of it. The access logs, the pattern, the institutional language. He did not soften it. She had asked him not to soften things. And he honored that even here, even now, when every instinct he had was to find a frame for it that hurt her less. She listened. She ate something, though not much. She listened. When he finished, she put down her fork and looked at him across the table with an expression he recognized. Not anger, not grief, but the particular look of a woman absorbing a truth she had already halfway known and is now fully knowing, and the full knowing of it is different from the halfway knowing in ways that the body registers before the mind does. "I'll speak to them," she said. "Camilla, I will speak to them," she said. "Before the review. Before any formal process. I will speak to them because they're my family, and because if something has gone wrong, it is mine to address first." He looked at her. She looked at him. Outside the window, London was doing what London does in the evening, indifferent and enormous, and inside this room, across this small table with its two formal silver and its two neat place settings, two people who had earned their life together were sitting with the cost of that life in the quiet way that people sit with costs that are real. And if the review recommends restrictions, he said. She picked up her fork again. She looked at her plate. She said, in a voice that was steady in the way things are steady when steadiness is a decision rather than a natural state. Then we follow the review. Charles said nothing. The word we did something to the air in the room that neither of them acknowledged. They did not speak much for the rest of dinner. But when they were done, and the table was cleared, and the room had gone to its evening quiet, he reached across and put his hand over hers, and she turned her hand over so their palms were together, and they stayed like that for a while, which was not a resolution, and was not a solution, but was the truest thing in the building that night. What neither of them knew, sitting in that room, their hands together on the table, was that one of the 6 rooms the complaint now lived and had, sometime that afternoon, developed a small and imperceptible crack. And cracks in palaces, as history had repeatedly demonstrated, do not stay small. The story broke on a Friday. Not the full story. Never the full story first. That wasn't how these things worked. It broke the way things always broke out of institutions that pride themselves on containment. In a fragment, in a shape that was recognizable without being complete, in the kind of language that forces a response while leaving the precise nature of the original event open to interpretation. A British tabloid published on its website at 6:47 in the morning a piece stating that palace insiders had confirmed the existence of an internal complaint lodged by a senior member of the royal household regarding the conduct of individuals connected to the Queen Consort's family circle and their access to royal functions and influence networks. The piece named no names. It cited no documents. It was, in the technical language of journalism, careful, which made it more dangerous, not less, because careful journalism about something real is harder to dismiss than reckless journalism about something false. Charles was in his dressing room when Hartley appeared with the printed text at 7:03. He read it standing. Again, he had a pattern now of reading bad news standing up, which he recognized and did nothing about. He read it twice, sat down, picked it up. How far has it traveled? He said. 3 other outlets have picked it up in the last 30 minutes, sir. 2 broadsheets and 1 television news desk. By 10 o'clock, I understand. He did understand. By 10 o'clock, it would be everywhere. By noon, questions would be asked in public forums that required public answers or deliberate silence, either of which was itself a form of answer. By this time tomorrow, every layer of the careful institutional management of the past week, the contained rooms, the formal review, the private dinner, the palm-to-palm conversation that had been the truest thing in the building, all of it would have collapsed into the undifferentiated noise of public spectacle. He thought, for a fraction of a second, about his first marriage, about how a private crisis becomes a public event, and how a public event becomes a historical record, and how a historical record becomes the thing people say about you when you're not in the room. He had been in that machinery before. He had come out of it, eventually had taken a very long time, and had cost things that were not recoverable. He was not going to let this become that. He called Camilla at 7:15. She had already seen it. Of course she had. She had people who watched the early news cycles the way military personnel watch radar screens. I've spoken to Annabelle, Camilla said, before he could ask. She had done it the previous evening, a conversation that had lasted 40 minutes, and that she had described afterward only as necessary and unpleasant. Charles had not pushed for more detail. She had offered. She didn't know how far it had gone. She genuinely didn't. He had received that without comment. The statement, he said now. Yes, it has to come today, before noon. I know. Camilla, it may need to be specific. Hartley thinks. I know what it needs to be, she said. Her voice was even. It had the quality of something that has been decided in the quiet of the night before, probably around 3 in the morning when she woke and lay in the dark doing what she always did in the dark, which was think her way through things until they became manageable. It needs to say that the family acted without my knowledge or instruction, that I take the concerns of the household seriously, and that I have personally addressed the matter. without naming anyone, without details. And it needs to come from me, not from the press office. From me. Charles was quiet for a moment. He wanted to say, "You shouldn't have to do this." He wanted to say, "This is not fair. None of it is fair, what you have given and what you have already endured, and now this." He wanted to say all of it. He said none of it, because she knew all of it, and saying it now would not serve her, and they were both, she more consciously than him, perhaps, in the part of this where sentiment was a luxury they couldn't spend yet. "All right," he said. The statement was drafted in 90 minutes. Camilla wrote the first version herself, by hand, at her desk, in her handwriting that was looped and unhurried and looked like a person who had made peace with going at her own pace. She handed it to Brentwood. Brentwood carried it to the press office. The press office revised it 3 times. Each revision traveled back to Camilla. She accepted 2 of the revisions and rejected one, putting back a sentence that the press office had softened and that she wanted to stand as originally written because it was more honest and less institutional than the replacement, and she had decided, in whatever calculation she had done between 3 in the morning and this desk, that honest was what she was going to be. The statement went out at 11:37. It was 4 sentences. It acknowledged the concerns. It confirmed she had spoken directly with the individuals involved. It stated clearly that going forward, all formal engagements connected to her household would operate under renewed protocols reviewed by the palace. And it ended with a sentence that the press office had wanted to cut, and that she had kept. "I have always understood that being part of this institution means holding those closest to me to the same standard it holds everyone else. I intend to honor that." It was in the assessment of people whose profession it is to assess these things exactly right. Not defensive, not performative, not the language of someone managing a crisis, but the language of someone who had already decided what they believed and was now saying it. The tabloid that had broken the story ran a follow-up piece at noon that was, by the standards of a genre, almost subdued. The broadsheets analyzed the statement. One opinion writer, who had spent 20 years being antagonistic to the entire modern royal project, wrote a piece that contained the sentence, "If this is what Camilla Parker Bowles sounds like when the ground shifts under her, the monarchy may have found something it has rarely had, a queen consort who understands that grace is not a style. It is a choice." It was a sentence that Camilla, had she read it, would have found both gratifying and slightly nauseating, and she would have made a dry remark about it that would have made Charles laugh. She didn't read it. Not that day. She was busy. What followed was not a resolution in any clean narrative sense. The formal review conducted by Household Security produced a set of recommendations, specific, proportionate, documented, that were accepted without objection and implemented over the following 3 weeks. Access was restricted. Protocols were renewed. The individuals at the center of the original complaint were quietly spoken to through channels that were official without being public, and they complied, which suggested they had understood what Camilla had said to them privately with more clarity than the careful institutional language of the formal process would ever capture. The guard who had lodged the original complaint, his identity remained known only within the small circle of people who had read the original document, and none of them offered it to anyone outside, was in the months that followed treated with the scrupulous fairness that the institution extended to people who had done the uncomfortable thing correctly. He had used proper channels. He had submitted documentation. He had been specific and evidenced. He had not leaked. Whatever his reasons for acting, and Charles, who had thought about this with more attention than the guard would ever know, whatever those reasons were, the manner of the action had been that of a man who believed in the institution enough to trust its processes rather than circumventing them. That mattered. Charles had made sure it mattered in whatever invisible ways a king can make such things matter. The crack in the building had let some air in. Air had also, in the nature of these things, gone out. What was harder to chart, because it moved in the register of private life where institutional histories don't reach, was what happened between Charles and Camilla in the weeks after. Not dramatic, not a rupture or a repair, because they were not broken, not in any way the word usually means. But there was a recalibration, the kind that happens between 2 people when they have been through something together that required both of them to be more than they wanted to be in a moment they didn't choose. a settling into each other that was slightly different from before. More deliberate, perhaps. More. And this is a word Charles would not have used, but that Camilla might have in the dry internal language she kept for things that were true. More earned. There was an evening about 3 weeks after the statement, when they were in the same small dining room with the 2 formal silver and the 2 neat settings. No crisis this time. No document on the table. Just dinner. Just the 2 of them, and the Patrick O'Brien novel still on the shelf in the study down the hall where neither of them had moved it. Charles said something about the garden. One of the flower beds was being replanted, and he had opinions about it that were more specific than the situation strictly warranted. Camilla listened, and then offered a correction about the soil conditions near the east wall with the same cheerful authority she had used about the hydrangeas. And he spent the rest of the meal slightly amused in the way that he was sometimes simply, quietly, relieved to still be in this particular life. He did not say any of that. He didn't need to. But there was something Charles returned to, in his own private way, in the months that followed, a question about the guard. The man in the bearskin walking his precise line outside the palace window that first morning, back straight, eyes forward. The man who had submitted 4 pages of documented, formal, signed concern out of what Charles now believed, because he had thought about it enough to believe it, was not malice, not political maneuvering, not any of the things it might have been, but out of a genuine conviction that the institution he had given 23 years of his life to was worth protecting, even when protecting it was uncomfortable, even when it put him in a room across from a king's domestic life, even when it asked him to name something that everyone around him had been choosing not to name. Charles had been angry in the first days, quietly, the way he was always quietly angry, the feeling kept behind the practiced face, processed in private, and then folded away. He had been angry that this had been made public, that it had reached the papers, that Camilla had been put through any of it. But the anger at the situation was different from the anger at the man. And the anger at the man had, over time, without any formal transition, become something closer to a reluctant acknowledgement. The guard had done what institutions, at their best, exist to allow. He had spoken. He had been heard. The process had worked imperfectly, noisily, in ways that created cost for real people, but it had worked. There is a version of this story in which Charles is the victim of institutional disloyalty, in which Camilla is the wronged woman, in which the guard is the villain, in which the palace is an enemy of happiness. That version makes a more satisfying drama. It has clearer roles. It offers the audience someone to root against. The version that was actually true was messier and less satisfying and more real than that. It was a version in which everyone involved was, in their own way, try to protect something they genuinely cared about. The guard cared about the crown. Camilla cared about her family. And then, when it became necessary, about something she cared about more than them, the truth of what she had agreed to when she accepted the life she was living. Charles cared about Camilla, and about the institution, and about finding a way to be loyal to both without destroying either, which was not a simple task, and had not been a simple task for most of his 75 years, and probably wouldn't become simple now. The palace stood. The monarchy continued its ancient, contested, perpetually questioned, perpetually persistent function. The guard walked his line. Camilla left another paperback somewhere in Charles's study. This one about Renaissance Florence, which he put on his bedside table and read half of before setting it down, and not picking it up again for 6 weeks, at which point he finished it and found it better than he expected and told her so, and she said, "I told you so," with a satisfaction so complete it was almost architectural. And Charles, who had been a prince for most of his life, and a king for a fraction of it, who had learned everything about duty and almost nothing about happiness until too late, and then relearned it in the slow, particular way adults relearn things that children would have absorbed without thinking, sat in a room that belonged to a crown, and not to him, in a life that was only partially his, and felt underneath everything, underneath the fatigue, and the complexity, and the unresolved question of whether any of this was worth what it cost, felt something he had not always been able to feel with confidence. He felt that he was not alone in it. That was the thing the document had not been able to reach. The thing the complaint could not inventory or restrict or formally review. The thing that no protocol existed to address, because institutions are not designed to recognize it, and monarchies least of all. The thing was simply this: that two people had looked at each other across a small table when the walls were coming in and had chosen, again, without drama or announcement, to stay. The crown endured as crowns do. But so did they.